let me give you the background on this particular one. This is AppSec Champions. And when the pandemic started last year, we had gone through this process of really transitioning to Zoom calls and not travel. And we had just rolled off of RSA 2021. And I think Black Hat had been canceled in person. So this is like late spring, early summer. And we're just trying to think of things to do that were interesting intellectually. And this was one of the things that came out of that. It was an idea that AppSec Champions, which we had known and seen and experienced and worked with numerous companies on this, the whole concept had never really been measured in any way. And that even though this whole concept of a champions program was a thing, nobody had ever quantified the numbers. So this was an idea to do that. And I'll give you the quick background of what we did, and it was a tremendous lift. It took the better part of last year and up to this spring, and it will, for those that are AppSec people and AppSec managers, this is real stuff that can help. Well, my background, AppSec person forever. I've been in the business for about 22 years, and primarily what I do is I help AppSec managers with these programs, and I'm an advisor on software risk for CISOs and CSOs. That's primarily what I do. The vast majority of CISOs are not developers or AppSec people by background, so I end up being that translation layer between the hardcore OWASP and AppSec, energies and activities to a less technical non-developer leadership. So making a business case for this stuff. So do a lot of speaking, and this was the project that we ended up doing. So this is a cool one. I also did for 2 or 3 years in a row, a surveys on developers and the impact of training, and presented those at numerous AppSec USAs, probably now about 6 or 7 years ago. So I did developer surveys on the impact of a security class and on their ability to write more secure code. So let me talk about the survey itself. As I mentioned, it was something that we came up with, and it became a thing. It became a big deal. We way underestimated how much time and energy was put into this. My original background and my original undergraduate degree was political science. So I had at least a technical bent from a survey and questionnaire standpoint and how to collect data. I'm also an MBA person, so technical and from a business standpoint and from a number crunching standpoint, and knew how to develop a hypotheses and questions that could be measured. So what I'll talk about today is the survey itself, the questions that I asked and how I asked them, the preliminary results or the results that came out of the study, and then leave enough time for questions and answers, I hope. So the first thing I did is we did what's called a structured research approach, which involved a set of interviews, because I recognized that yes, you could send out a survey monkey and get certain sets of data back, which were interesting, but given the early stage nature and kind of the emerging stage nature of AppSec Champions, that maybe some of the more interesting observations would be from follow-on questions. So what I ended up doing is having a series of interviews and really picking the programs was part of it, because I wanted to not get sample bias. And so I'll talk about that a bit. But we wanted to really capture the best practices, stuff that we saw in the field, the common practices, identify some of the common challenges, things that people experience, and put numbers to that. And then try to see if there's any commonalities out there around, pipelines, cloud, security demands, like the organization itself. And, so what we ended up doing is we focused on people that are AppSec managers, people that are program owners, subject matter experts, and regardless of their title, regardless of their role. And that was the starting point, like people that knew this stuff, that had a program. So if they didn't have a program, we threw them out. Or one that was very interesting, if they called it an AppSec Champions program, it was a glorified developer training program, we threw that out too. So perhaps the starting point for the discussion is an AppSec Champions program itself is the use of a centralized security team, typically reporting to the security organization, that is using concepts of influence and managerial leverage to influence a much larger development team that doesn't report to them. So absent of formal kind of command and control, as they say, not ability to compel them to do a lot, but the use of a small tight-knit team to influence lots more people. So what I ended up doing is having several interviews, teeing it up, getting the business justification, getting them to participate. Because here's the other thing: if you deal with big companies, not all of them want to share data, any data. So we had a few that were very interested, would be great members. I probably talked to 50 companies. I ended up getting 26 that I went through this whole drill with. But like, there was a lot of people that didn't, they couldn't get corporate, their CISO or couldn't get corporate PR to do this. So their corporate policy wasn't to participate. So again, the output would be a research report and a published white paper, which I've got a final draft of. And that's one of the things that if you're interested in this topic, I'm publishing that in the next 30 days. So the background is I had it mostly done in the spring after working on it all last year. I did the writing and iterations, and then we got bought out by Coalfire, Group did, and the marketing folks were like, wait a second, this is kind of cool to send out. So they put it on their marketing docket and embargoed it. And here we are, it's November. So like anxious to get it out, but it's pretty cool. You like it if you're interested. So the candidates for the survey, like, again, given the bias of sampling, I wanted to focus on a few common attributes for the starting point. Again, that they had a full-time application security staff, regardless of what their job titles were. They had somebody that managed the risk of software full-time. And that throws a lot of companies out. And I said, as I mentioned earlier, we did 26 that were either building at the earlier stages or built. If I got people that were thinking about it, everything would be zeros. So there were a few in there that were at earlier stages. The industries represented, as you might imagine, are some of the larger ones that had complex development efforts. They had lots and lots of teams that probably regulated, certainly had supply chain pressures. So that's the pharmas, banks, tech, telecom, financial services. No public sector, so no governments. Not really small, medium-sized business. The smaller companies probably more SaaS and had more of a SaaS or like fintech flavor to them, if that makes sense. They didn't have 10,000 seats or 10,000 people, but they were super paranoid because that's what they did. So over 50% of the 26 had 10,000 seats or above. So these are big big AppSec programs where the use case probably is 5 or 6 or 7 AppSec people, and then thousands of developers. So one of the questions I asked, I'll get to, is what's that ratio between the two? Because I thought that was interesting. So that's the background of the candidates for the survey. And as I mentioned, I had to talk about 50 to get to 26. And as I mentioned, there's a few in there that, I'm like very promising candidates that were like, oh, wait a second, that's just a training program. And they didn't have any other components of AppSec champion stuff. So I asked 4 types of questions. And again, like when you go in to do one of these things, you have certain hypotheses and certain ideas. And given that I've been in AppSec and worked with companies and programs, I had, this was not the first time I'd done this. I had some idea. Some of the questions turned out to be more interesting. The responses turned out to be more interesting than others. But the first set of questions were around the organizations itself. How many devs, how many AppSec people, how many teams, where did they kind of think they were maturity-wise, on a kind of bastardized CMMI schedule, maturity level. Also about environments, about how many, had pipelines in cloud, how many were having their apps resident in the cloud or, look more traditional on-prem. I asked 2 questions about time. How long did these programs take to build? How long had they been in place? And I got some interesting answers there that I didn't anticipate, to be quite candid. I asked about program attributes itself. Did they have a mandate? Did it look like the trusted computing memo from Bill Gates over 20 years ago, where Bill Gates woke up one day and said, "Thou shalt write software more securely"? Or did it come up organically from the development team as a comparison? Were there standards in place? How did these organizations recruit AppSec champions for the dev teams? Was there training and tools? And again, this is interesting because in order to accrue the value of scale, and again, we're talking scalability and leverage here because you have a handful of people trying to influence potentially thousands. Without that proper set of tools and documentation, it's all an anecdote. And so I asked questions around that. And then I asked two questions around ROI that were very simple and broad. Are you achieving results? And if so, how do you measure those results in an ROI fashion? The thing that came out of this is most certainly there is, areas for future research and additional questions. And there is some sense that we'll probably end up doing this again because there's just so much left on the table. And I'll get that sense. Hopefully in the questions and answers, that'll come out. So this is an interesting one. The first question I asked around organizational background was like, how do you characterize your AppSec Champions program? And I gave some attributes of this. And one of them I asked was, do you consider yourself maturing? And there were, are you doing regular scanning? If you looked at like a BSIM or OpenSAM, where do you feel like you are? Have you done that at all? So I gave some broad, editorial discretion here. And in these questions, if they told me that they looked a particular way and then the rest of the responses didn't look that way, I would go back and double back. Like if they said, oh yeah, we're optimizing and they're using like one DAS scanner and not doing anything else, no threat modeling, no requirements, no value, no. There's, some sanity there. So that was the first thing. So the average, most of the people said that they were maturing. Some of the newer ones said they were emerging, as you might imagine. There were only 2 or 3, I think, in the whole survey that said they were mature. There was none above that. So interesting. Okay, so here's the numbers that came out from the 26 companies. How many developers do you have? Average, the mean was about 1,600, which is a number that really doesn't mean a lot, right? Because there's a lot of variance. It's like there's lots, so thousands, or in this case, in nearly 2,000. So, but a picture is starting to emerge here. How many AppSec staff do you typically have? 13. And in that, if you look at the small organizations, it's like, okay, the use case of handful of AppSec people, that hundreds or thousands of dollars started to come out from this. The other one I asked that really was almost not a throwaway question, but like didn't really have any meaning is how many champions did you have? This was all over the place, depending on how how they allocated them across teams. So it didn't really tell me much and probably begs further analysis. I did ask how many dev teams they had in general. And what I came to find out is sure enough, there's like cross matricing and double counting problems. So I just threw that one out it just didn't strike me as interesting. But the thing that did was in the programs that self-identified as mature, they had a 1 to 50 AppSec person to developer ratio. And if you throw in the maturing ones, that goes to 1 to 150 to 1 to 100. And then after that, it was all over the place, right? But like the maturing programs were quite interesting. The ones that had other attributes of goodness. And my understanding is that it does track with what the guys at Synopsys have seen in their BSIM questionnaires, which I think is pretty cool. So that's a key finding that comes out in the report is like, hey, it's 1 to 50. It's a number. That is one that I want to do again because that jumped out and I didn't expect that to be as cool as it was. Okay, so we looked at other aspects of testing to infer sophistication too. We asked, like what kind of tools and tool sets did they ask? We asked how many apps were built in pipelines or distributed, built and distributed through pipelines. So about 61% said over half. So, but that was almost all of them said, of course, that's moving that way. Interesting, the people that were pretty much more traditional, certainly as it related to cloud, were the bigger on-prem financial banks, the big banks. But this is certainly going towards, as you might imagine, pipelines in the cloud. What percentage of your apps were hosted in the cloud? It was divided. 38% said over 90. So that's an example. But the key finding that jumped out at us is everybody that said that they were mature had all 3 types of major testing technologies. And a lot of them had IaaS too. So I don't get an email from the guys at Contrast and Sonatype and different places like that. It was the key point here as analysts and others have said is you to really infer truth, you have to have 2 or 3 types of technology, certainly SAS and DAS, probably SCA, even better with IAST, and then go from there. So that bore out in these numbers, is the mature ones had that, and that was one of the key findings that came out. So, all right. So here is an area that I asked around the time. How long did it take to build these programs? And about like it's somewhere between a year, about half of them said about a year, up to a year. And then about 20% said 1+ year. And it's all over the place, but it's safe to say if you start tomorrow, it's at least a year and probably a year to 2 years, realistically, to have coverage across the teams, to have material impact and feedback from the teams. And but so that's about a year. Now the interesting one, I asked the next question. Well, wait, I probably should ask the other one first. I said, like, how long have these programs been in place? Sure enough, we had a few that have been out there in the fintech and financial area for over 4 years, and it had multiple iterations. The majority were somewhere in there 2 to 3 years or a year, but a good 27% said NA. What that really was they didn't know. And so that's reflective of substantial turnover, as you might imagine, as you probably have experienced anecdotally, substantial turnover from developers and AppSec people. They just didn't know. The other thing that came out as a secondary question that I didn't anticipate here, and I included in the report, was about the issue about programs that had complete resets. And just a little bit of a sidebar here, when I mean a complete reset, where they were often running for 2 years and then had a key person leave or had a leadership focus change, or, I mean, who knows, maybe even a security incident, but they completely lost somebody and it was a do-over. My assumption going in was that these things always were going to be growing and doing better and expanding and having depth of coverage, and that is in fact not the case. In a big chunk of the organizations, they have total reset. So that's in the report itself. I put a little aside to managers. It's like, these take care and feeding. Like, don't assume that they'll have organizational momentum. So just an FYI. So another interesting thing, going in, a hypothesis was that these things kind of happen organically. It's, the Bill Gates memo is an example where maybe not so much, where you had strong, like, hierarchical or down, chain of command guidance, but not so much in this in the report. At least 2/3 said they had nothing, or they had the CISO mandate. Well, I mean, like, let's be candid. If you don't have the CISO mandate, you don't have anything. So, like, that's almost like a existential. Yes, of course we had the CISO mandate, but the point here is that most of them happened organically. Ironically, these organizations have these, very smart technical leaders who become, hack the organization from within and grew it, these programs with, in many instances, very little managerial oversight, with very little investment, and certainly with little or no formal mandate. So I think that's pretty cool. Like, they become a thing without it, being a thing at the CEO, CFO, COO level. And I did ask that question. I think we only had one that had the COO. The rest were the CTO. Okay, that's now we're talking. That's where the development lived in that organization. But I think there was only one that had CFO, CFO, COO, or CEO. And there were none that had CEO. So this is an important thing to recognize. Somewhere in your journey, you have to have that. If you don't get it, you should go back 2 years into it and try to get it. So just a little aside. Some other program attributes. Do you have defined roles in standards? I asked that question, and majority said they did, but it was kind of I was expecting higher in that. 62% they said. And the question there is, like, if you don't have defined roles and standards, how do you scale this program? How do you communicate across all the dev teams? Is it tribal knowledge? Is it conversation? Is it oral history? Like how do you do that? The other thing is, I asked the question, like, how did you recruit? And the majority there, I sussed this out in the report, but were volunteered and voluntold. The assumption here is that the best way to do this is to have them volunteer, to be bought in and not be told, but between those two, that largely is the way you recruit. The preference by far is volunteered. If you, there's a whole series of discussions, and I think one of my colleagues presented on how you build and recruit. I didn't get to see that, but I'm going to. And then you have a format for formal training, like is there an approach? Like the majority didn't, nor did they have actual rewards programs. And this is when I say rewards, I mean, a formal recognition program broadly. So if you don't have a formal training program, again, how do you scale? How do you do it? That was a little bit surprising. The rewards one is an opportunity missed, I would say. And rewards doesn't mean purely monetary or recognition, but the more sophisticated organizations did in fact bake it into their performance management system, into their ratings as attributes. They also did formalize recognition, even if it wasn't monetary, like through peer recognition, through whatever, just like, hey, great job, through gamification. That's I think a table stake, to be quite candid, and probably further, an opportunity for further discussion and analysis. Okay, so how frequently did these leaders, the AppSec leaders, communicate with their champions? Most were constantly, and then at a minimum monthly, right? So it was interesting because we asked this question, a lot of it's ad hoc too. And you could say, well, okay, we used Slack. Okay, of course, everybody used Slack or the equivalent, Slack or Teams, right? But, so 64 used Slack and Teams. Some had some pretty cool portals that they used, so the gamification stuff. Some of them use some of the platforms that you might imagine, the typical tooling that help provide visibility across the teams. But the interesting thing that came out of this, that's in the report that I didn't really capture in this presentation, was a recognition that you have to have Slack and Teams for kind of the day-to-day chatter, but that doesn't substitute a formal communication strategy to the masses. So almost all of them used Slack and Teams for day-to-day chatter and back and forth and more direct guidance. But that was complemented by either a monthly newsletter or email or an in-person town hall type deal where they could do recognition and stuff. So put that in there as a key thing to remember if you're rolling out these programs is, yes, you have to have Slack and Teams and day-to-day channels to provide prescriptive guidance and scalability, but you also have to have the human part, which is the communication. Okay, so I'm going to leave enough time. I'm going to capture 2 or 3 more things and then jump into questions and answers. Are you achieving your desired outcomes? This was the area that I suspected would turn out this way, but was still disappointed. So 42% said they were, but like those were soft, it was soft responses. And for several of the product security companies and fintech companies, they said, yeah, we feel that we have, but we've never got that acknowledgement from our buyers, for our clients, which would be stronger. Some of the anecdotes that came out of this section or included in the report were pretty slick. For example, a fintech CISO who said, wait a second, I was asked on a due diligence call by one of the big 4 banks about our AppSec program, and then the AppSec champions specifically. He just totally like, hey, you guys have an AppSec champions program? And he went into a little discussion. Sure enough, they won the big, huge contract for that big bank. And the sales VP was like, I don't know what that AppSec champions program is, but keep doing that. So that got a pretty big, was a big deal for the CISO, enough where he told me that in the outbrief as a side story. So have you been able to quantify, any type of success anecdotally? And the numbers here point to areas for future improvement. Like I think it's safe to say, if it matters, it should be measured, or something. You in a corporate environment where you're competing for resources and attention and time, this has got to be part of your program, even if not year 1. Is the ability to show successes through, lower bug count, mean time to fix, whatever you agree upon, gamification. You've got to have something. Okay, so like I'm going to wrap up and have plenty of time for questions. There were some interesting things that came out of this. People are still very evangelical, as you might imagine. There's a strong belief in these programs, but I still characterize them as informal, immature, and needing of additional nurturing, to be quite candid, in managerial oversight, which is very interesting, but it's true that the ROI, although was mostly anecdotal and a case for improvement, and candidly was leaving stuff on the table, leaving an opportunity there. As I mentioned, a strong observation was that they had weak managerial mandates across the companies we surveyed, and that there's interesting correlations between the devs and AppSec staff and the tooling and maturity. Again, SAS, DAS, and SCA, I think were pretty slick. And like I said, that it was a Herculean effort to grab that data and then make something of it. If you're interested in this, please reach out afterwards, because I'd like to do this again. I don't know if I'd do it again outside of a pandemic. So it was like a captive audience. And it took probably, hundreds of hours and was pretty much a heavy lift. There's some other relevance, and I would just add to close here, that if you're an AppSec manager, leader, security architect, CISO, that you should read. There's an Andy Grove book on, he's a former CEO of Intel, about management, and he talks about managerial leverage, which is the concept of doing something once that has just a widespread activity, widespread impact, because you're able to get others to do things for you. Understanding how to apply that, understanding that you're, in a weird way, a marketing and sales professional promulgating these programs. There's a lot of irony in there, but it is, I think, true. The comparative data that came out of this, you can use, particularly as it relates to ratios and to staffing. I think between what we've done and what the other guys have done at Synopsys, I think is pretty interesting. In order to gain leverage, you should use these incentives. You should do formalized training, and you should measure your ROI. I mean, I think you're leaving things on the table if you don't. And ultimately, we're successful not when we're gatekeepers or builders or whatever. It's when we get our software development brethren and colleagues to view, the security of code as another facet of quality, resiliency, if you want to call it that. And with that, so this is a big deal. There's a lot out there. I hope you've learned something. I've already got requests to continue to do this type of thing, or maybe even work on a community interest around this topic. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Jackie. I think we have plenty of time here for questions.